Oh, welcome everyone to the Sociology of Media Interest Group space, where we are commencing our Voices series. How voices influence and are influenced by media platforms in Australia and spaces throughout the world. I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping. We're going to have a welcome of country, and then I will formally introduce our guest today, which is Dr. J. Daniel Thompson. He will present his paper. We will then have a short Q&A section, and then the seminar will be closed. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of the Wurundjeri and the Warren and Burunong people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to the past, present and emerging leaders. And I welcome to anybody else who's seated on unceded lands throughout Australia. I would now like to formally introduce Dr. J. Daniel Thompson, who will discuss cultivating ethical online communication in an era of digital disinformation, journalists and online community managers as agents of change. Dr. J. Daniel Thompson is a lecturer, professional communication in the School of Media and Communications at RMIT University. His research explores ways of cultivating ethical online communication in an era of digital disinformation and hostility. He argues that this kind of information is necessary for the online health and safety of all internet users. Dr. Thompson's research has been published in journals such as Feminist Media Studies, Media International Australia, Journalism, Continuum, and Sexualities. Dr. Thompson is currently completing a co-authored book with Professor Rob Cover and Dr. Ashley Hall on fake news. And now it's over, and a big welcome to Dr. J. Daniel Thompson.
Well, thank you, Rick, for that very warm welcome. And I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I reside, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. Okay, so on the 6th of January 2021, a throng of demonstrators stormed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They were protesting the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, which Donald Trump claimed he lost illegitimately. The protesters include this man on the screen in front of us, the so-called QAnon shaman. And you can see he's wielding a placard that read, "Q sent me." Of course, QAnon is an internet conspiracy theory based on the premise that Mr. Trump is trying to save the world from a cabal of elite, blood-imbibing pedophiles. Okay, the Capital Riot led to 5 deaths and 53 arrests. This remains one of the best known and extreme examples of the profound harm that online disinformation in its many and varied forms can cause. The proliferation of this information online can be traced in no small way to Web 2.0, and particularly the rise of online networks. I'll be talking today about my current project, which will form the basis of the DECRA application that I'll submit later this year, and which poses the question, which I may reword slightly, but old mate here on the screen here. What roles can journalists and online community managers play in cultivating ethical online communication about disinformation? And we move on. So, before beginning the paper officially, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what interested me in the project and how it relates to my own research trajectory. And as they say in ARC land, why I'm the best person for the job. So, This will provide some sense of the topic's intellectual and political importance and of why I've chosen to pursue it. So my academic research has predominantly focused on media controversies. You earlier, Rick, mentioned the feminist media studies paper, which was, of course, on Barnaby Joyce's sex life. I'm very proud of that one. The paper, not the sex life. And I've been particularly fascinated with the ways in which dissenting opinions on a given issue are debated in public sphere fora. The incivility and the sense of talking past one another that can characterize these debates, and the factors technological, ideological, that have contributed to this incivility. To quote a famous line from the 1967 film Cool Hand Luke, which later emerged on a Guns N' Roses album, what we've got here is a failure to communicate. My earlier research explored media controversies around gender and sexuality. Around 2018, I developed an intellectual and personal curiosity in digital hostility, the forms it takes, how it reflects and perpetuates existing inequalities and hierarchies, and how it might be mitigated. I read scholarship on this topic by researchers such as Emma Jane and Whitney Phillips, not to mention the Australian journalist Ginger Gorman. I also developed a strong interest in the dissemination of disinformation in online spaces. That interest solidified during those early days of COVID-19, which seems so long ago now, but it was only 18 months. And the spread of misleading information, this infodemic, as the World Health Organization calls it, regarding the novel coronavirus. Digital disinformation and digital hostility are both products of a digitized mediascape in which communication is more rapid and global in its reach than before. Specifically, both phenomena suggest a profound failure in online communication, a historical moment in which opportunities to talk with others has become opportunities to talk past, to talk down, to talk at, and to talk about, often in highly hostile ways. As Alanis Morissette put it, isn't it ironic, don't you think? Disinformation can itself be a form of digital hostility with its aims and its outcomes, often being the endangering, indeed the destruction of careers, communities, health, and lives. The research project I will be discussing today does not seek to eliminate digital disinformation. That's a sizable task, and it's one that's beyond the capabilities of a single researcher. What I want to do is establish how exactly online communication about disinformation, and I'll explain that term a little later, can be cultivated in such a way as to encourage a range of views and viewpoints, to mitigate harm and incivility, and to emphasize the importance of facts. Conceptual framework. So, a key theoretical component of this project is Manuel Castell's influential model of the network society. Castells uses this term to describe a social structure that is, and here I quote, made of networks in all the key dimensions of social organization and social practice. He goes on to write, While networks are an old form of organisation in the human experience, digital networking technologies, characteristic of the information age, powered social and organisational networks in ways that allowed their endless expansion and reconfiguration, overcoming the traditional limitations of networking forms of organisation to manage complexity beyond a size of the network. In the contemporary world, digital networks are key sites through which communication is produced. Now, Castells defines the term communication as, and here I quote, the process of sharing meaning through the exchange of information. I wanted to share that because communication, being media scholars, scholars of society, sociologists, is a term that appears in our everyday lexicon so often as to appear trite and meaningless. It's not trite and meaningless, it has a meaning. Communication is essential to the meanings we construct of the world around us. Our experiences of this world are shaped and reshaped by our interactions with others, be that face to face or more often these days online. There are distinct benefits to the kind of rapid global information exchange that a network society enables. And Castells talks about a number of social movements that have arisen online. He talks about the Egyptian Revolution, Occupy Wall Street, and I'd also add Black Lives Matter and Me Too, both of which arose a few years after the 2012 publication of Castells' book, Networks of Hope in Our Age. Of course, though, more communication does not mean better communication. For example, witness what I'm calling the digital pylon, in which large numbers of internet users take to social media to publicly admonish, bully, and slam down famous and not so famous individuals who have committed transgressions of varying kinds. My colleague and co-author Rob Cover and I have a paper based on the digital pylon, which is forthcoming in Convergence Journal. Plug. These pylons, as we argue, aren't always designed to help the transgressor to see the perceived or actual error of their ways. They're not about fostering hope for anyone. They're about reinforcing the communicator's righteousness or sense of righteousness and humiliating the perceived transgressor in the most public way imaginable. On that point, I suspect if Castells was writing his book today, it would be called Networks of Outrage and More Fucking Outrage. Similarly, more opportunities to communicate can mean more opportunities to communicate info that will not bring anybody any hope. In fact, quite the reverse. And this project focuses on one such strand or strands of information, and that is disinformation. So the term disinformation, and here I quote, refers to content produced to generate profits, pursue political goals, or maliciously mislead, as in the form of hoaxes. There are crucial and interrelated factors that have driven online disinformation movements, some of which I'll touch on in the paper today. These include a growing distrust in news outlets and the news media, an anti-elitism that is evident in the rise of populist movements and leaders. We've got Donald Trump in the US. We've got Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, political polarization, the fragmentation of online audiences, the latter of which is a result, in part, of political polarization, and which has meant that users being confronted with disinformation in partisan or alternative media are less likely to encounter information correcting or challenging false claims. I'm just going to press pause on the video there and just say, as an aside, there's a robust discussion to be had another time about the usefulness or otherwise of concepts such as filter bubbles and echo chambers. Axel Bruns, the renowned media scholar from QUT, does a really brilliant job of this in his 2019 book, Are Filter Bubbles Real? This is not a paid presentation. So, further, it's the affordance of the contemporary internet, not the internet of 1997, which is when my family got it, not the internet of 2010, the contemporary internet that has meant that artifacts of disinformation get produced faster and distributed more widely than they might have even 10 years ago when Costello was writing those books. A few examples. GIFs and memes. Memes are, after all, units of culture that are designed to be spread because they can resonate with their target audience on some level, e.g., through use of emotions, through use of pop culture imagery, and so forth. We can all think of many examples. I'm very fond of memes too, just not the ones I'm talking about. The use of bots to spread disinformation about politicians and political parties on social networking sites during elections. And I hate to go back to it, but the 2016 US election, key example. My favorite, videos that include interviews with so-called experts who have spoken about the truth. The documentary Plandemic is the best known example of this. And monologues from disinformation proponents, in which those proponents explain how they awoke to the lies being spread by governments, mainstream media, academics, doctors, and so forth. I'm not going to promote or publicize. A quick search of Instagram or YouTube will reveal exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes this disinformation is overt. See, for instance, as the memes, which I'm not going to show, alleging that those inoculated against COVID-19 are dangerous. On other occasions, this disinformation is presented in more coded ways. See the tagline, do your own research, which sounds fair and reasonable until you realise that it's another way of saying ignore expert opinion. See, we've got the undercurrent of anti-elitism, distrust in expertise, if not outright hostility. Disinformation isn't always produced with the aim of harming, though harm in its various guises is an inevitable outcome or outcomes. Some examples, and there are many. QAnon supporters have been reported as being responsible for acts of public violence. For example, hunting down people and trying to kill people they suspect of being pedophiles. This movement has also contributed to family and relationship breakdowns. And the Reddit support group QAnon Casualties offers some quite devastating accounts of these. The allegations that the 2020 US election was robbed from Trump, allegations that the man himself promoted at a rally beforehand and on Twitter before he was banned, perpetuated a growing distrust in the electoral process. A distrust, I would wager, that gave rise to Mr. Trump in the first place. The riot that unfolded at the Capitol that day suggests there were many Americans who believed the best way to redress that apparently corrupt electoral process was through violence and civil unrest and the loss of life. In 1998, the British physician Andrew Wakefield published a study in a respectable medical journal alleging a link between the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine and autism. This study received extensive media coverage at the time, and it was followed by decreased numbers of parents getting their children vaccinated, and what do you know, increased rates of infection. Funny that. Wakefield's study was thoroughly debunked, but the damage had been done, and we can see many of the ideas promulgated in that paper alive in the anti-vax movement, which, as my good mate and colleague Mark Davis has elucidated, are particularly active on social media. You want to get a sense of how disinformation is produced and disseminated, you look at what the anti-vax people are doing. I'm not recommending it, by the way, but just it's there. The disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories that have circulated around COVID-19, we could devote a whole conference to this and have only scraped the surface. They include theories that the virus was invented by the Chinese government, that it stemmed from unclean Chinese eating habits, that it had been fabricated by governments for the purpose of increasing domination over their citizens. The proliferation of this disinformation has helped give rise to an international wave of violence and discrimination perpetrated against those of Asian descent, including people I know personally. Given these kinds of harms, it might be tempting to simply recommend blocking disinformation proponents from online platforms and discouraging any talk about their potentially lethal discourse. That is simplistic, and it's also unrealistic. Just as disinformation proponents are communicating their views to public audiences, so too are those audiences, us, others, anyone with internet access, communicating with each other about that disinformation. If anything, any call to not talk about that disinformation, don't talk about the war, could be what Foucault calls an incitement to discourse. It actually has the reverse effect of encouraging us to talk about it, because that's not what we're not supposed to do. It's elsewhere called the Streisand effect, but you see where I'm going. The challenge I suggest, and this is what animates my project, is to cultivate ethical online communication about disinformation. So, the term ethics refers in the broadest sense to those principles which guide our conceptions of what is right and what is wrong, of how to treat others and ourselves in a way that is least likely to perpetuate harm. In a 2014 study, another mate of mine, the journalism scholar Dennis Muller, lists 4 key concepts associated with media ethics. I'll just go through them quickly. Freedom of speech, the ability to speak one's mind without censorship or the threat of censorship. There's an idea going back to the sort of gurus of classical liberal theory, like John Stuart Mill, that an open discussion of ideas in public sphere fora is essential to a democratic society, and that truth, and here I quote, truth would emerge from the free exchange of opposing ideas, and that if society wanted to be guided by truth, it had to let this exchange happen. This is what we know as the marketplace of ideas. I'll come back to that. The avoidance of harm principle. This has been adapted from Mill's study on liberty, published in 1859, and refers to the imperative for us, for all of us, to at least minimize the risk of harm to themselves and others. Harm may never be entirely preventable, but it can be mitigated. The public interest, I'm not going to go, whether or not an issue or piece of content has an objective impact on the broader public, or at least a group or groups within that public, that it's not simply a matter of personal interest or curiosity. And of course, censorship, a word that the News Corp Australia seems very fond of. Censorship being commonly understood as an affront to free speech and democracy. The exception being if a piece of content is said to be cause harm, in which case it may be justified by the avoidance of harm principle. So what I've done here is the model of ethics that I've described here is a normative model. Such models do have distinct advantages. I entirely agree with Muller, for example, that the concepts he discusses are important to any ethical approach towards mediated communication. It's important to acknowledge, though, that such approaches also have some limitations. They can be a little too journalism-centric. The encouragement of diverse voices in public sphere fora is admirable, and it's one I share. But I suspect it's overly optimistic, if not outright naive, to believe that the truth, or for that matter, facts, will somehow win out in a marketplace of ideas. All around us, we can see examples of the opposite happening. Moreover, this model does not adequately capture the interactive nature of the digital mediascape. Peter J. Fourie comes closer when he suggests replacing the term and the concept of media ethics with what he terms ethical communication. Fourie writes, ethical communication provides a more comprehensive and inclusive foundation for normative media theory and provide for dealing with all the changes of the new media landscape, a landscape that's not quite so new anymore. With its focus on human communication, ethical communication reaches beyond journalism and provides a platform for not focusing only on the informational journalistic, but also the fictional, marketing and advertising content from the media and media practice and performance. Ethical communication, look, it can be produced by journalists as well as other internet users. It can take various forms, from memes to long form articles to GIFs to everything in between. Is concerned with mitigating harm and with being respectful to others, including those who hold views different to one's own. It emphasizes human interaction towards the achievement of human virtues. That's a quote from Fourie. And is not and I think this is the most important point in some respect, it's not telling people what to do or say. Cultivating communication does not mean pressuring or coercing others to toe a party line. So, my research into online communication has been influenced in no small way by existing research into public sphere communication, most notably Jürgen Habermas's influential and oft-cited scholarship on this topic. Habermas famously theorized the bourgeois public sphere of 18th century Europe. And here I quote, the sphere of private, I love this man's prose. It's just magical. The sphere of private people come together as a public. They soon claim the public sphere regulated from above against the public authorities themselves, to engage them in a debate over the general rules governing relations in the basically privatized but publicly relevant sphere of commodity exchange and social labor. In other words, the public sphere was the site in which citizens, in which us, came together to deliberate on and debate the issues of the day. The public sphere was traditionally inherently democratic in nature. That's at least how it's been conceptualized widely. Mark Davis lists argumentation, evidence, truthfulness, mutuality, reciprocity, good faith, and inclusiveness as public sphere norms, which, while never fully adhered to, nevertheless underpin our democratic culture. As Habermas himself acknowledges, the public sphere he was theorizing was bourgeois and European, not to mention a few centuries old. The limitations of his model has been further highlighted by a generation of feminist, post-colonial, and recently digital media scholars. There's no space here to do justice to the arguments made by these critics. Suffice to say, the public sphere, however it may be understood, it is itself a contested topic, is not inherently democratic, nor does it always promise inclusive or ethical dialogues between people. So, and I suppose following Mark, I would suggest that the public sphere norms, such as those he lists, are principles that are at least worth aspiring to when cultivating online ethical online communication. These may not always be fully adhered to. Nonetheless, it's worth working towards. They serve as a good base, a standard or sets of standards. So, the big question, what does this ethical online communication look like in practice? This is something I aim to find out through fieldwork with my two target groups, journalists and online community managers. So I've chosen these groups as participants because of the roles each play in cultivating online communication. You've heard me use that term a few times, so why? So my trusty, concise Oxford Dictionary defines the term cultivate as meaning to improve, develop, pay attention to, cherish. The act of cultivating communication means enhancing, or at least attempting to enhance, the quality of it ensuring that the communication is as ethical as possible. Journalists are themselves producers of online communication in the form of their journalism. They're tasked with communicating to their audience about the issues of the day. Journalists play no smaller role in constructing public understandings of these issues, and through interviews, they can also introduce other voices into the public sphere. Just a disclaimer here, I have myself worked as a freelance journalist since 1998. In recent years, I've produced articles on digital hostility, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Public responses to these have generally been quite positive, though I have received some hostility and recall when one high-ish profile misogynist mocked me on his various social networking avenues. I should also add that this abuse is not nearly as severe as the abuse that women, people of colour, the disabled, trans, who write on these issues have faced. And I would here at this point refer to Ginger Gorman's wonderful book, Troll Hunting, published in 2019. Gorman is herself a victim of what she calls predatory trolling. And has quite an incisive and disturbing look at the state of play. A state of play I'd say has only got worse in the 2 years since her book came out. Online community managers are responsible for overseeing online communities. The term online community isn't shorthand for a website or a social media account. It usually encompasses a range of platforms. Online communities aren't the same thing as social networks. The community designer Liz Jackson writes, online communities and social networks are very different. The first offers a sense of place, the other is not a place, but a kind of group consciousness grown from comments, images, addresses, photos, and appointments to do something or be somewhere, whether it's real or virtual. Online community managers decide what content is acceptable for that community and what is not. They can decide who joins these communities and who must be removed. Their role certainly does entail content moderation, but they're not only content moderators. I've made a dreadful error of using those terms interchangeably. Content moderation is something that online community managers do. It's a very important task or set of tasks. It's not the only one. In this project, I'm referring to these media professionals as potential agents of change. The aim of this is not to increase the scope of or complexity of their roles or to hand them extra tasks as if they don't have enough. My aim is to determine how best these groups of which are as diverse as any other, can be equipped to cultivate online communication regarding disinformation in a manner that's as ethical as possible. So by online communication regarding disinformation, I mean online discussions, e.g. in web forums, below an article that's published on social media or in an online newspaper. Journalistic reportage of disinformation. And communication that might be regarded as disinformation, or at the least as disinformation adjacent. So just an overview of some of the questions I want to ask. I'll leave them on the screen here for just a few seconds. If any of you are interested in looking at the slide, this is being recorded, so You can come back to them. These are of the two groups. And of course, there are different questions I'd like to ask the separate groups. Certainly with journalists, what are the ethical issues and benefits in interviewing and quoting disinformation proponents? This is an ethical minefield, and it's one that journalists and media outlets face every day. And do ethical considerations bear upon your reporting on disinformation movements and their proponents? Moving forward, participants, I'll just say a quick word about those journalists. They'll likely be based in Australia, due in no small part to COVID-19 travel restrictions. Thank you, good old COVID. Ideally, and this is still being worked on, if any of you have any suggestions, comments, criticisms, ethical communication, I'd be very interested in hearing them. I mean that. I'd ideally like to interview 15 journalists and 15 community managers. Of the journalists, ideally a mix of self-employed and staff journalists. Each faces very different sets of working conditions, opportunities, risks, and so forth. In fact, I went to an excellent MEAA seminar on this topic just last night, in which it was raised. Ideally, of the staff journalists, I'd like to interview staff from the 3 major Australian media outlets: 7 West Media Group, News Corp Australia, and the Australian Broadcasting Commission, as well as smaller outlets, e.g. the Bragg Media. Online community managers from a range of online communities, business focused, entertainment focused, and so forth. I'm particularly interested, and again, the ethical can of worms gets opened here, in interviewing community managers from some of the more niche platforms that tend to harbour conspiracists and the far right, e.g. Telegram. Again, that'll be a conversation I'll have with the ethics committee further along. But it is something it's something I want to do, and I think it would benefit the project immeasurably. Like I said, there's rich diversity in both groups. Recruitment of participants, I do talk about a little. Invitations from advertising online, the snowball sample, methodology and field work, a range of one-on-one interviews. You can tell I've been putting together a grant at this point. Ethnographic research with online community managers. Again, the actual form that this will take depends in no small way on COVID restrictions. I would like to be in the same room witnessing what they're seeing, the challenges, the decisions, and so forth. Group interviews with journalists and online community managers in year 3 to road test and fine-tune recommendations for best practice for both groups in dealing with disinformation, and critical discourse analysis and content analysis of Australian journalistic reportage on disinformation, undertaken in year 1 of the project, and will hopefully enable me to ascertain trends, blind spots, areas for improvement, and so forth in the reportage of disinformation related issues. So my throat is getting rather sore, but we are heading to the end. Conspiracy. No, we won't go there. So to reiterate, disinformation poses a grave threat to contemporary democracies, as well as to the health, safety, and well-being of everyone. The increased prevalence of disinformation in online spaces is a testament to the affordances of Web 2.0 or 3.0, whatever we're up to, and specifically the emergence of online networks. These networks have been the sites in which some of the major social movements of our era have gained shape, but they've also enabled, notice the term I'm using, not caused, enabled, the spread of toxic and factually incorrect material about everything from vaccines to presidential elections to 5G technology to Tom Cruise and everything in between. Yet, as I've argued, staying silent on disinformation is undesirable, not to mention impossible. What my project seeks to do is understand how journalists and online community managers can help cultivate online communication in its various forms that is as ethical as possible. What exactly this communication will look like remains to be seen. At this early stage, I envision it to be communication that is fact-based, that aims to mitigate harm, and that avoids demonizing disinformation proponents while acknowledging the grave damage that their discourse can do. So watch this space. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's mind-blowing. If we can now take the slide and we can see everyone again.
Yeah.
We'll just like to see. Great, wonderful. How does everyone feel? I mean, unmute yourselves. Leonie, how did you find that? Did it challenge your ideas?
Beautiful. Yes, it certainly did. I work in healthcare.
Oh,
so,
fascinating. Yes.
That's right up my alley. And I've got a question.
Yes. Oh, I love it.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah. And that is, you have a comment about experts.
Yes.
And of course, each night on the telly, we get different experts. And of course, they don't all say the same thing. They say different things. What's your view? And we have to look at ourselves in this when we think that we might be an expert in some small area as well. What's your view of experts in relation to what you've been saying? What an expert is?
The term expert is generally ascribed or assigned to those who have a specific, generally rich knowledge through years of training and practice in a specific field. So I would refer to myself as an expert on digital media communication. It doesn't mean I have all the answers, but it does mean that this is something that I've been following in a critical manner for a number of years. A dentist, for example, is expert on oral health, teeth, and so forth. A skin cancer specialist would be an expert on skin cancer and sun safety. There's a few points in there I want to tease out, and one of them is the conflicting advice provided by experts. And that's nowhere more evident at the moment in Australia than in the discourse about AstraZeneca. Do take it, don't take it. If you're under 40, don't take it, do take it. There's a higher risk, there's no risk. What the fuck is going on? So I have a certain, I suppose, the empathetic side of it. I didn't talk a great deal about empathy, but it is something that informs my position. My ethical position as a researcher here is that I have great sympathy for those who may hold anti-expertise views, saying that they're lying to you, given that I'm in the same media ecosystem. I can see this at work and I'm just as confused as you. So that's where I draw the line is in what I'm gravely concerned about, I should say, is the ironic, I think, given their anti-expertise status, the self-construction of the new expert, the brackets anti-expert. For instance, I've been found many a late evening engrossed in videos by people who are variously anti-lockdown. There's a lot of blurring between the lines here. That's why I say disinformation adjacent or QAnon adjacent, where They might believe that the New World Order is coming in, where they'll also be anti-pedophile, they'll also be etc., etc., etc. That by virtue of their passion in this, by virtue of their research that more often than not doesn't appear to extend beyond internet searches on factually dubious material, that they know better than those who've trained for years, for example, to be work in mental health or medical practice or whatnot.
Thank you. And I don't want to hog all the time, but the role of influencers comes in here too, that the influencers are given incredible sort of, I'll say expert status, but that isn't quite right, where people believe what the influencer says. It's incredible to me. However, they have this following, and it's fascinating.
Exactly. I'll just say something briefly about the influencer because they fascinate the hell out of me, is that they can be a force of enormous good. I would also, for example, here refer to the work of the Melbourne doctor, Michael Rozinski, who's very active or was very active on TikTok and Instagram, producing really short, often quirky and funny videos that dispel COVID, misinformation and disinformation. The problem there is it's still reifying the doctor, who knows, that could still be held up by a disinformation proponent as, oh, look, it's the medical establishment, it's big pharma, it's the state,
yeah, thank you.
Going on with what Leonie says, I'm also quite interested about influencers. And one of the ones that really stands to my mind, I just wanted to have a comment by you, if you can make a comment, is about Peter Evans. And we know him from My Kitchen Rules, because
and other endeavors.
Yeah, but it was interesting because when he was in a health space, the association with eating and well-being, and yet some of his ideas that he was purporting on the internet and through social media about, I think he also raised about being anti-vaccine, and I think he even raised the issue of having a machine that you could buy and that would, I don't know, somehow protect you from COVID. That was one of the theories. And so how does, again, going with people like that who have a profile, a media profile, why is it that people still regard them as an expert or an it's expert, but take so much notice to what they're saying, more so than, say, a person with a doctorate or somebody with an expertise within that area? Why is it that if someone has 1,000,000 followers, why are they? Does it, like, do you ever? I'm fascinated by that.
That's a huge question, and one that it will take me several days to give an adequate response to, but I'll do as well as I can in a minute or two. I'll refer specifically to Pete Evans because he's the best known anti-vax proponent, at least in the Australian context we find ourselves at the moment. I found his rhetoric beginning around 2015 and ending quite dramatically on Instagram to be highly disturbing because because due to his celebrity, a celebrity cultivated through his cookbooks, through his appearance on the television shows, gave him a far wider audience than, I don't know, Joe or Jane blogs down the road with their little YouTube video, hi, take your mask off. That's what makes him so profoundly dangerous. I'm unable to, I think what Pete Evans capitalized on here, and he capitalized on it quite nicely, was this anti-expertise strain in public discourse. He was right, he did. It's a performance of outsiders. It's a performance almost of rebellion. Oh, look, I've got this information, and let's not think how I got the information, but I've got it, and I'm speaking the truth that doctors and governments don't want you to hear. Of course, he never said so in as many words. Interesting with Pete Evans, interesting in terms of online management and content moderation. Look, ultimately, I agree with the decisions of Facebook and Instagram, and I think Twitter, to block the guy. I don't think he needs another panel, another, By the same token, I can't help but think that that's contributed to his narrative as someone who's been silenced, as being censored, for daring to speak truth to power. And of course, there are a million other social media channels and modes of communication that Pete Evans and others can take up. So it's not the end for him.
It's wonderful. I think we could go on forever, but I know we have to wrap it up. But just maybe if you would have some of the last words, Jay. Sorry, Leonie. Yeah.
Sorry, Rick. There's a comment in the chat. I saw it come up from somebody else.
Okay. Yeah, I think
that was just
really?
That was just me saying, kind of jumping off Ricky's question and saying I've actually just been reading about this, like how it is that people come to follow
fabulous.
People who have these huge followings of people who kind of blindly. So she kind of talks about modern day, not necessarily like big cults that we've all heard about for years, like Nexium and Scientology and all that. She does talk about those things, but she also talks about the kind of modern day groups and influencers and disinformation and conspiracy theorists who have these kind of blind followings. At some point, I think she also talked about celebrity stands and the royal family and all of that. But there's so much interesting stuff in there about what kinds of things are happening when people will just take on board anything that anybody ever says without like critiquing it. And even just Taylor Swift fans, it can be quite insidious how much Taylor Swift can do no wrong. Like she could probably say that she supports the KKK and her like Taylor Swift stands would just go, yeah, right on. Like there's something going on, and it seems to ultimately a lot of it comes down to the way that they use language in this really charismatic way, particularly cult leaders and people like Pete Evans and all of that. There's a persuasiveness to the way that they talk about some of these topics that makes the content of what they're saying not matter as much as how they're delivering it, and this kind of infinite wisdom that they claim to have, this wokeness. So I don't know if there's much in that you're going to be delving into, but it's just something that I found to be really fascinating to read about, and it kind of jumps off what Ricky was talking about. So.
It is. Yeah. And I would say I haven't read the book yet. I do intend to, so thank you. I'll be heading to a bookstore later, so great. Is that someone, Pete Evans is a remarkably charismatic man. Remarkably charismatic. Equally, and I think this might be where I sort of draw things to a close, I don't at any point aim to position myself as outside, as being the sort of elite academic in the ivory tower, glaring on down at the unwashed masses because I know better. That's not. We exist in the same media scape. We've all been through, for instance, COVID-19. We know what these last 18 months of unprecedented unpredictability have been like. They've been fucking awful. And I think the key word there is unprecedented. And I think it's also, and this is something I'll be bringing up in a paper next week, plug, Ansgar.
Absolutely.
Is that rather than looking at us and them, it's better to look at disinformation proponents as being among us, not apart from us. For only considering those who are propounding disinformation, as it being not other but the same, that we can work towards ethical solutions, ethical modes of communication. And as I've said, ethical online communication is absolutely important. We're at a real, not even a crossroads here. We've gone past the fucking crossroad. We've gone past it. We're at a really crucial point in human history, a point where just as we can communicate with one another like never before, we can weaponize that communication. More communication doesn't mean better. So how do we make better, cultivate better?
That's wonderful, Jay. Can I just finish off by asking, if people wanted to read more about your ideas, can you just give us a plug to let us know where they can, where they can contact you, or another where they could read your ideas?
Yes, I'm very contactable. Well, I mean, actually, we're working together. My email address is jay.thompson@rmit.edu.au. I'm also very active on Twitter and can be reached via LinkedIn or via email. Very happy to discuss at length any of the ideas I've traversed today.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and everybody, for contributing. And we'll make fabulous, and we'll make sure we include all your handles, if it's the word, on our website so people can contact you. And thanks again for this wonderful, insightful discussion. And we hope to have more with you, because I think there's so much we can do in this space. And as things are evolving at the moment, we would love to have you back for another follow-up, because it's wonderful. So thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for contributing.